Um, Thanks very much, Boris. It's great to be here and participate in this event. And as Boris mentioned, I'll speak about this exhibition that I co-curated at Nottingham Contemporary, which is a city about 2 hours on the train from London. Last February, this exhibition, January actually, this exhibition opened. It had about maybe 15 or 16 artists in it. It was more of really a research exhibition project where the material, the conceptualization of the project, the research that went into it, the theoretical and the political elements that we attempted to trace in the show were really quite important to the project at large. So it wasn't really imagined or intended as simply a gallery exhibition. Although I'm gonna present a number of the inclusions, a number of the artistic examples that went into the show, and after I tell you a little bit more about the idea for it. But I thought, because I just came from Venice, I thought I would say a few words to try to position the exhibition in relationship to the Venice Biennale, which in some ways, correlates with rights of nature in the sense that it provides a very critical diagnosis of contemporary conditions in terms of the contemporary global crisis that we're confronting today in relationship to war and militarism, migration, ecological destruction, right? So the fact that Adrian Piper, whose work I'm showing here, that also won the Golden Lion in Venice, states that everything will be taken away, in some ways serves as an example of what that exhibition was attempting to do, which is to show that sense of crisis that is multifaceted and incredibly complex in terms of our global reality. And she presented this series of works in the exhibition, as you see here, where you have this text written across the image of, in this case, two people. Their faces have been wiped clean, as if they've lost all sense of their identity. And as we look at them in a kind of mirror reversal, we don't know how to position ourselves. We don't know who we are anymore. The conflict, the negation, the catastrophe has wiped out our identity. What is left? What is to be done? These are the questions that, in some ways, the Venice Biennale leaves us with. So in that sense, it's an incredibly pertinent exhibition that really says something about our contemporary world. On the other hand, I found, at least in my view, it offered little assistance in mapping out ways to approach this. It provided little help in how we might approach many of these problems politically, how we might come together in challenging these conditions that ultimately have a lot to do with the global hegemony of neoliberal capitalism, right? This is very much behind the exhibition. So when Okwi and Wazer in the Venice Biennale has performers that are choreographed by the filmmaker and artist Isaac Julian read the 3 volumes of Karl Marx's Kapital, right, on stage in the middle of in the Giardini Central Pavilion. What does that do for us? I mean, it's in a way, it's a kind of spectacularization of this performance of reading Marx, but it offers, I found, hardly any suggestion of what we might do, of providing a roadmap of how we might approach and do something about all these problems that are otherwise represented and even aestheticized in the exhibition. So the fact that there was little, I thought, little self-consciousness in terms of the institutionalization of art, the support for the global art market, the representation of mainstream commercial galleries within the show, but at the same time the reading of Marx's Capital, in a way pointed to the contradictions and the incredible problem that the Venice Biennale leaves us with. I'm not trying to at all compare the exhibitions, because this Nottingham exhibition was incredibly small in comparison with the enormous resources that went into the Biennale. But nevertheless, the intention in this exhibition, Rights of Nature, Art and Ecology in the Americas, was an attempt to trace this emergence of what I think is a revolution in legal thinking around extending rights to natural subjects. So, in other words, this is an incredibly important development in environmental and legal thought, in juridico-political thinking, that attempts to provide some approach to how we might do something about the enormous crisis that we find ourselves in relationship to ecology, in relationship to global warming and the destruction of the environment, of massive species extinction, and the threat of drought. I'm living and working in California now, which is experiencing a catastrophic drought and massive forest fires that is destroying thousands of hectares of old growth and new growth forests. So this is a absolutely critical situation in relationship to the environment that I'm sure you're all familiar with, that is mapped out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and will be addressed in December in Paris at the next meeting of the UN Climate Change Conference. And so this is all coming together right now in ways that we continue to learn about this catastrophe, the crises, as we learned about at the Venice Biennale as well. So how does rights of nature? What is this legal development? If you're not familiar with this, what does it mean? What does it signify? And how are artists part of this process of rethinking the conditions of legality in relationship to a biocentric approach to environmentalism, or an approach that displaces the relation of land to property as it's largely defined within our contemporary capitalist condition, in order to extend a sense of legal subjecthood to trees, to rivers, to forests, right? What does that mean, and how are artists engaging with this? So the rights of nature is a something that is coming out, that is emerging from a variety of different origins of discourse and political practice. And I'm just showing you one example, a couple examples of this. One is this. There's a number of books that have been written recently about the rights of nature that bring together a range of intellectuals and legal thinkers and environmental lawyers from across the world, from India to South Africa to the States to Ecuador and Bolivia, which are particularly important places in relationship to this formation. And they have proposed that natural subjects be extended the rights of legal representation. So in effect, the shift that we're talking about is that with the rights of nature, as it's been enshrined, in fact, in the legal constitution and codes of countries like Ecuador and Bolivia. So here's an example of Evo Morales in Bolivia in April 2010, when the law of the rights of Mother Earth was enshrined in the country's constitution. So this is a move away from the idea of nature being valued solely in an economic way as a form of property, right, to a reevaluation of the natural world in terms of its intrinsic value, according to an ecological logic in relationship to the environment and its biodiversity and its capability to reproduce itself according to natural law, basically. So this is something that has been, as I said, has been developed within different theoretical frameworks. So one origin of this is the work of Cormac Cullinan, who is a South African environmental lawyer. Another important voice in this discourse is Vandana Shiva, who's an Indian environmentalist and an activist. Someone else is Wangari Maathai, who is, before her recent death, was a Kenyan environmentalist who did a lot of work in relationship to deforestation in Central Africa. So there's a range of thinkers and participants in this discourse, coming from environmental law, but also from indigenous politics. And here I think there's a really important connection and something to think about in terms of the indigenous challenge to largely Western post-Enlightenment ways of thinking about development and our relationship to nature. So the exhibition and the discourse of the rights of nature in some ways comes out of Amerindian thought. So if we think of indigenous peoples in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Peru, in Brazil, and the way they think about Mother Earth, what they call Mother Earth or Pachamama, is really a crucial origin for the activism and also the legal environmentalism that has gone into this legal revolution toward recognizing the rights of nature. So this is just part of the huge and expanding visual culture around the Dia de la Pachamama, or the Day of Mother Earth. In this case, it comes from Argentina, but this is August 1st, if you didn't know already, is the Day of Pachamama, or the Day of Mother Earth. It's different from Earth Day, and it has, rather than a Western, a North American origin, it comes very much out of indigenous thinking, which never had the kind of this theoretical separation between the human realm of culture and the natural realm of the environment. So that division between nature and culture, as many people point out, as many anthropologists have argued, as many indigenous thinkers have discussed, that division has never existed in much of indigenous thinking, in much of indigenous legal codes, ritualistic practices, and religious beliefs. So the idea of extending a sense of right to natural subjects is not such a conceptual challenge within indigenous practices at all. So an example of this recently is the 2012 Carioca II Declaration that brought indigenous peoples together in Brazil to confirm this agreement that gained support among indigenous peoples toward attempting to recognize the rights of Mother Earth and to extend and support legal sovereignty and autonomy for indigenous peoples across the world, but particularly in the Americas, in South America, and Central America, and North America. So this is something, this indigenous activism around environmentalism, environmental justice, climate justice, and human rights is something that's particularly powerful and lends a real sense of political urgency to approaches to rights of nature that was very much behind the exhibition. As I'll get to some examples of the show in a few minutes. But let me say just a few words about what environmental justice is, if maybe you're not completely familiar with this development. But environmental justice, or translated into climate justice, is a politics of environmentalism that insists on the fact of the differential effects of environmental destruction on people who are coming from impoverished areas or disenfranchised classes. And this has historically impacted indigenous people in incredibly destructive ways. So if we speak about the genocide of American indigenous peoples throughout the last 500 years of European colonialism, then a big part of that was not only the destruction of indigenous peoples, but also the destruction of their environments and their ways of life and their practices of what we can now call sustainability and their support for what is now called Mother Earth and their relationship to nature. So environmental justice is something that recognizes the differential impacts, say, of climate change as well. That is, the people who are in certain areas of the world who are not prepared, who are under-resourced, who don't have the facilities or the funds or the money to adapt to the changes in our climate, will be hit harder than other people. So climate justice recognizes the power differential of climate change, and that's really important to recognize and to reject the kind of what we could call the false universalism that we encounter in some forms of environmentalism. The idea that we're all in this together and that we're all suffering equally, right? This is, in some ways, a kind of myth that is very reassuring to what some people who are writing about this, like Ramachandra Guha, who's an Indian environmental activist, what people like that would call an ecology of affluence, right? This is something that the show Rights of Nature wanted to try to avoid. An ecology of affluence, which is an environmentalism coming from the developed world of privileged people who would want maybe to emphasize and limit environmentalism to a matter of, say, ethical consumerism, as if we can buy our way out of climate change by supporting things like the right light bulbs or the right kinds of cars, right? If we can exert our environmental agency through consumerism, then we can change the world. This is exactly what proponents of environmental justice or climate justice try to criticize, because obviously it's a kind of false universalism. So this surge in indigenous activism is happening across the Americas, which is really important. There's no equivalent of this in Europe. I think it's often very challenging to speak about indigeneity in the British and European context, because there's not just that the discourse doesn't exist in the same way. But for example, in Canada, Idle No More for the last couple of years has been a major political movement that has been bringing Indigenous First Nations, as they're called in the Canadian context, together to struggle for human rights, for sovereignty, for cultural autonomy, and to demand respect for their treaty rights that have gone back decades and even centuries within the North American context. The difficulty of speaking about this in the European context is there's a tendency to romanticize indigenous identity, or to idealize indigenous ecology. There's been a number of books published about this that have criticized this and investigated what some people call the ecological Indian, right? As if Indians or Native American people or indigenous people have some kind of natural or essential relationship to ecological sustainability, right? This is, of course, a huge problem, and it tends to stereotype people and put them in a straitjacket of identity that is incredibly problematic, and it refuses to recognize the complexity of what people like the anthropologist Jim Clifford calls indigeneity in process, right? Indigeneity is something that's always being invented. It's something that's modern, that is occurring today, that people are living through the contradictions between Western developmentalism and neoliberal capitalism and indigenous traditions all at the same time. And how that identity is negotiated is often very complex and far from clear. So rights of nature has been something that is connected to indigenous activism and environmental rights and human rights, but it's also something that connects to critical practices in the West from people who are attempting to find ways to invent ways to find resources that help us to think beyond the conditions of neoliberal capitalism and its form of green capitalism, or it's the way that capitalism today is attempting to address the environmental crisis that we are confronting. So this is leading to really, I think, fascinating hybrid intellectual constructions where rights of nature comes together with indigenous politics and also legal transformations in the West, including North America, Bolivia, and Ecuador, and other places. So that rights of nature, in this sense, as a legal phenomenon, attempts to challenge the relegation of nature to a form of property, as if we can find in nature, as if we view nature only as a form of wealth accumulation, as if it can be endlessly instrumentalized, and as if we can endlessly extract forms of natural wealth from the environment. So rights of nature challenges the whole development discourse that has gone back that goes back to the Enlightenment, to the birth of the Enlightenment. So roughly, 500 years of colonialism has also been 500 years of the colonization of nature, and so rights of nature attempts to contest that. It attempts to move beyond it in a way that relies on a source of legal activism, of a juro-political intervention in legal codes and the way in which they structure corporate and governmental realities. Okay, so this is leading toward what some call for, which is a great transition. People like Naomi Klein, again Vandana Shiva, others, many figures are pointing out the fact that we're living in not just an unsustainable reality, which you hear almost on a daily basis, but really we're confronting a crisis situation that calls for a radical reformation of the way that we relate to the world. And so in that sense, I think this legal revolution offers one among other approaches to the conflict and the crisis that we're living through that really, I think, is worth taking seriously and offers a lot of traction and agency, collective agency, as well as institutional, political, and legal agency against this critical situation that we find ourselves in. So in that sense, I'm trying to explain that the exhibition the exhibition's conceptualization attempted to. What we're interested in is trying to find mechanisms that provide a sense of political agency today in the present for how we might address, how we need to address the conditions of this crisis, of the epistemic conditions of everything will be taken away. Right? This is a matter of urgency that I think Adrian Piper does confront in that work that Okui opens up with the Venice Biennale, but without proposing any solutions. The rights of nature is one, I think, really incredibly important resource for how we might address this. So let me shift gears now and talk about a number of artistic examples of how this is addressed within, the cultural sphere. So in our exhibition, we had a range of practitioners doing work in a number of different media. Some was, I think, for example, in the case of Shubhankar Banerjee, who's an Indian-American photographer and environmental activist, approaches it in somewhat of a traditional photojournalistic way. Others who are more conceptual and speculative and experimental in how they address this condition of this legal revolution called rights of nature. So this is the work of one of Shubhankar Banerjee's photograph that is about a caribou migration in Alaska in the far north. A hot spot in relationship to climate change, in relationship to the threat to biodiversity and melting ice and changing climate conditions owing to industrial capitalist activity and the fossil fuel economy. So it's a shot that shows you a range of animals moving across the ice sheets of the Arctic. And this is work that goes along with his writing, which you can't get a sense of that if I just show you the single photograph. But he really contextualizes these images in relationship to explorations of developments of drilling enterprises in the Arctic. This is a huge controversial issue right now in relationship to oil drilling and natural gas drilling in the far north. So, for example, President Barack Obama recently visited Alaska to lend support to his environmental platform. And this occurred, paradoxically, only a few weeks after he approved an agreement with Shell to allow oil drilling in the Arctic. So it's exactly this paradoxical situation that we confront, that Shubhankar is dealing with in his work, attempting to call attention to the challenging conditions for forms of life that are non-human in the Arctic. So part of what he's interested in with the caribou migration is how the migration patterns are shifting because of changing climate conditions. And so that is explored more extensively in his writing, but that's what he's showing you here, is the unusual, eccentric migrations of animals who basically are confounded or upset by these shifting climate conditions and what it means for weather patterns in the Arctic. In the exhibition, this was paired with a work by Alora and Calzadilla, who presented this piece called A Petrified Petrol Pump. This is a gas station pump that's been petrified. So we take a petrol pump that pumps fossil fuel that has itself been as if it's been fossilized. So it's a glimpse, at least this is how we viewed it in the show. It's a glimpse of a future condition where the fossil fuel economy has itself been outmoded and fossilized. So we were attempting to confront different temporalities and attempt to indicate what a post-fossil fuel present would look like. Maybe the work that comes closest to investigating the rights of nature in the Latin American context is this piece by Ursula Biemann and Paulo Tavares, who collaborated on this project. Ursula is a Swiss artist and Paulo is Brazilian. So they investigated the rights of nature in the Ecuadorian Amazon in this video installation, mixed media installation called Forest Law from 2014. Maybe some of you have seen it. It's traveled around a little bit. And they explore what the development of the oil economy in Ecuador has meant for indigenous people like the Sariaku, who's presented in the video installation. This is Jose Gualinga, the leader of the Quechua people of the Sariaku, a micro-minority Amerindian group that's based in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And they have been confronting decades of oil industry pollution in the Amazon, in the area where they live, that is befouled the rainforest and created enormous problems for human and animal health in the area. And he explains this in the video. It's partly documentary to investigate how the Sariaku people have been attempting to negotiate this situation where the president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, has recognized the rights of nature in the Constitution of Ecuador, which is in some ways a very progressive, important step within Earth jurisprudence. But on the other hand, Correa has supported drilling and the oil industry and development in Ecuador in ways that completely contradict this legal progressive step. And so this contradiction or this paradoxical situation is something that the Sariaku people are attempting to work their way through, ultimately to support their environmental and social justice activism in the area. So Paulo Tavares and Ursula Biemann explore this in their work, providing a range of resources, drawing on satellite data that explore the conditions and analyze this development in the Ecuadorian Amazon, contextualizing it theoretically and historically in relationship, for example, to the work of Michel Serres, who wrote a book about the natural contract a couple decades ago, which is a really important precedent to the development of rights of nature. Michel Serres, in that work, said basically that if you look back historically on Western post-Enlightenment society, you could say that we are at war with nature. For centuries, we've attempted to dominate and establish human sovereignty completely over the natural world, and this is, according to Serres, coming back to haunt us today. So in their video project, Biemann and Tavares interview people like the Sariaku activists, as well as people living in the area who are supporting environmental justice and attempting to argue for the right of the Sariaku to determine their environmental sustainability. Someone like Donald Moncoya is a really important figure in this, and figures in their video as well, where he performs forensic analysis of the forest floor. And it turns out that Texaco, that has become Chevron, has conducted oil extraction in this area for decades, and they've left enormous pools of toxic oil sludge just simply on the Amazon floor without ever cleaning it up. And this still exists to this day. And so people like Donald Moncoya have pointed to this and shown the evidence of the presence of fossil fuel on the floor of this incredibly biodiverse, rich region in the equatorial Amazon, in order to draw attention to this quest, which is also transforming into a legal challenge, drawing on rights of nature discourse to try to hold corporations responsible for the destruction that they've wrought in places like Ecuador. So this is really, I think, crucial. And in this piece by Ursula Biemann and Paulo Tavares, they tried to investigate what this means, to bring out these the different legal elements of this. For example, when the Sariaku brought their case to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in Costa Rica in 2011, so that what we have here is, you could say, a crisis of epistemologies, or even a crisis of ontologies, of some philosophers and anthropologists have suggested, between, on the one hand, indigenous cosmologies or indigenous cosmopolitics that attempt to assert the sovereignty and legal rights of the natural world against a Western model of environmental law that can only recognize rights when it comes to human subjects. So the shift that we're encountering here, that's moving from a form of law that's dominant in Europe and North America, that's based on property relations. We're moving from that property-based notion of legality to a biocentric or earth-based notion of legality. That is also part of a transformation from Western post-Enlightenment secular thinking to a new way of thinking that recognizes indigenous cosmologies, religious beliefs, ritualistic practices, legal codes, and cultural worldviews. So this is really, I think, absolutely fascinating. It also connects to the Ernesto Neto installation, I think, in many ways, because he's also trying to present different entrances into what it's like to experience the conditions of an animistic, non-Western belief system that really has a lot to do with an inseparability between the human world and the natural order. So I think there's a direct connection to Neto's exhibition. So in the Tavares and Biemann project, they also provide a way to think about, again, indigenous relations to the Ecuadorian Amazon. So they show in this one segment of the video Julio Tiraram, who's a Shuar shaman, presenting the different elements of the forest on a table, and there's this bird's eye view of this presentation, which is basically a kind of forest pharmacy. It's a drawing on traditional knowledge, traditional medicinal value of plants that is, has been available, has been developed through decades and centuries of indigenous cultural practices that is tied into their local biodiverse cultural situation in the Amazon. And so this kind of closeness to this biological literacy of the natural order of things in the Ecuadorian Amazon is particularly fascinating as a way to juxtapose in the indigenous relationship, in this case the Shuar relationship to plants, compared to something like Chevron's relationship to the forest, which sees the forest simply and completely only as a source of money-making and wealth accumulation through the destructive practices of the fossil fuel economy. So this juxtaposition between the cosmopolitics of the Shuar versus, say, the necropolitics of petrocapitalism is I think, is incredibly powerful in this piece. The exhibition also investigated cultural practices in Mexico, looking at the Zapatistas and what they're doing in Chiapas in southern Mexico in terms of not turning to courts of law to recognize their rights and to try to establish the rights of nature, but to actually seize the rights through an insurrection or rebellion that attempts to establish their sovereignty over this area in which they can create and define and defend a sense of autonomy. And so in the exhibition we had a presentation by a group of, they call themselves GIAP, or the Group of Investigation into Art and Politics, that have looked closely and analyzed the aesthetics, the politics of aesthetics of the Zapatistas and the Zapatista revolution, and have done so in a relationship that brings together human rights and indigenous sovereignty and environmental sustainability. And so that was an important part of our exhibition. We included, for instance, some of the traditional Maya representations of the Zapatista, including this project by the painter Beatriz Aurora, that shows you in this image a presentation of Zapatista ecology. Here's a detail from, it's quite, there's a lot to look at, but it shows you the commitment to organic agriculture that resists the ecology of NAFTA, of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and its support for corporate monocultures and chemical-intensive farming. So this is a return to ecological sustainability achieved through organic localism and the practice of autonomy and the sovereignty of seeds. That resists what people like Vandana Shiva and others call the biopiracy of the pharmaceutical and agricultural industry, that attempts to commodify and patent seeds. So corporations like Monsanto and Syngenta attempt to control and profit from the production of genetically modified seeds. So the Zapatistas represent a really crucial contribution to the not only the imagination but the realization of a different world that is based on forms of social justice, equality, democratic practice, and ecological sustainability. So in a way, they're realizing the rights of nature. That it's not it's not simply an ideal political dream for them, but it's something that they're actually attempting to bring into existence today, and have done so since about 1994 when they began their revolution. So it's a difference between Ursula Biman and Paulo Tavares and the Sariaku and the Ecuadorian Amazon, who have attempted to turn to legal institutions in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in other places, and the Zapatistas, who are attempting to seize power and create their own world in the here and now, without turning to dominant forms of institutionalized power. So we tried to map that in the exhibition, the differences between these different approaches. A few more examples before I finish. We also included the work of Jimmy Durham, who's an expat Native American artist who reflected in these works on the history of colonialism and the conditions of indigenous identity today. This is a piece in the foreground called La Malinche, which refers to the Native American translator and also lover of Hernán Cortés, the conquistador. And she's a very interesting figure in relationship to the history of the conquest of Mexico, because she exemplifies this figure who's in a way working with the Spanish, with the colonizers, but on the other hand, as historians point out, she had no choice, and she was trying to work within the conditions of colonization to try to do what she could to negotiate the conditions and save the people that she could from this destructive military conquest of her lands. So Jimmy Durham has turned to this identity of La Malinche, I think, as a way of exemplifying the conditions of indigeneity. That is, indigeneity, according to Jimmy Durham, in a piece like this, can only be seen as a form of violent dismemberment and reconstruction. Indigeneity can never be considered a form of authenticity or essentialism. From this moment on, from the moment of colonial contact, indigeneity would be thrown into disarray. It would be forced to reconstruct itself in a way that recognizes the onslaught and the damage, the destruction of colonialism, and also attempts to create ways of survival within these conditions. And this, I think, continues to the present day. And someone like Jimmy Durham could I think exemplify this in his work in really moving and subtle and also humorous ways. Another approach to indigeneity is Abel Rodriguez of the Nonuya people in Colombia. And he presented a range of works that attempted to diagram the local flora and fauna in his area of the Amazon in Colombia, in South America. So this is one of his pieces, his small watercolor that show you, in this case, a azulejo bird, a bunch of grapes, and a fruit bat in this composition, and he translates this into Spanish and as well into the Nonuya language. So as you probably know, indigenous languages are under threat. The world is losing indigenous languages at an increasing rate these days. So his project of ecological survival is also directly related to linguistic protection and revitalization in Colombia. And so here again, there's two different approaches to rights of nature. On the one hand, rights of nature recognizes the indigenous roots of that came into formation under the terms of violent colonial conquest, but also forms of political negotiation in the name of survival. And on the other hand, in the work of Abel Rodriguez, as you see in the background, there's the range of watercolors in that photograph that show you his almost encyclopedic attempt to recover an indigenous biological literacy with his environment. It's again somewhat similar to what the project here is doing in relationship to the Brazilian indigenous group that is also doing drawings of their native plants and attempting to recover and record and encode indigenous knowledge about the local environment. So different approaches to what indigeneity means today, I thought was an important element in the exhibition. Okay, just a couple more examples. We also included the video Medium Earth by the Autolith Group, a London-based collective whose work you may be familiar with. They've shown here as well. In this project, they attempt to look at the California desert and the way in which the earth can be thought of as speaking a language. If we attempt to extend rights of nature to the environment, and if that legal subjecthood allows the environment to represent itself in courts of law, then the next step within this conceptualization is how does the environment testify? How does nature speak if it gains legal subjecthood, in the same way that corporations have been allotted legal subjecthood, right, within the West. How does nature actually testify or provide witness in courts of law? So the Autolith group investigated the speculative question that correlates with this, the philosophical developments in speculative realism and what is called the ontological turn that's occurring in different philosophical and academic contexts today. But again, how do we attempt to move beyond an anthropocentric epistemology and try to confront the ontology of the natural world, the being of the natural world, that itself exists and signifies and has its own language in ways that we can become sensitive to, right? So the Autolith group's film, Medium Earth, attempts to investigate how the Earth is itself a medium of representability and signification or language. How is the Earth a source of language? Finally, Amy Balkin, a San Francisco-based artist, contributed a video that is basically shows her, the artist, reading the the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change's 5th Assessment Synthesis Report that came out in 2014. And so she actually reads the entire report. So we took this as, I think, not so much in the way that I mentioned before, how in the Venice Biennale they have a public performance of the reading of Capital, right? It's not in that sense. If anything, the reading of the IPCC 5th Assessment Synthesis Report attempts to confront the difficulties and even the illegibility of this kind of scientific language and the impossibility of its transmission from the scientific origins of the study to the public. Like, what do we make of this? How do you read the IPCC's 5th Assessment Synthesis Report? It's not, and how do you translate that into a cultural context? In a way, the piece attempted to draw attention to this report, but at the same time acknowledge through the very aestheticism of the video, it acknowledged the difficulty of translating that scientific knowledge into the cultural realm of emotional subjectivity of how we might live in the world. How do we live in the world with the scientific knowledge? This is what the project attempts to confront. So that's the rights of nature. It's an exhibition that lasted for a couple months, and it's part of a longer project for me as I attempt to address these issues in my own work. As I've indicated, I think it's increasingly a kind of ethical and political imperative to confront this, to think about it. It very well be, if we actually attempt to consider what scientists are telling us, this is the largest crisis that we are facing, possibly in the history of humanity today. So I think it's increasingly imperative to think through this, to attempt to come up with ways of addressing it, and to shift our perspective, and to attempt to to contribute ways of changing, of entering into what Naomi Klein has called a great transition. How do we do that? How do we do that within the academy? How do we do that within art exhibitions? How do we do that within the world that we're living from each of our individual perspectives? How do we do that also collectively as a political project? These are all critical questions that I think it's crucial to think about. So I'll end with this. I've recently moved from London, where I worked for about 10 years, to California. I'm now at the University of California at Santa Cruz. And one of the interesting things, one of the attractions of that move was the ability to create a center for creative ecologies that I've created at UC Santa Cruz, And this is the website of the center that's just gone up. I just put this online in August. So I hope to research these issues more and attempt to think through and develop ways of addressing ecology from a creative and also activist and politicized perspective that recognizes not only the importance of environmental justice and climate justice, but also indigenous cosmopolitics, as well as environmental activism and artistic and activist contributions to this incredibly complex area, but also urgent area to address today. So I think I'll end there. Thankfully, it hasn't rained. I'm available for questions if you'd like, if anyone has any questions for right now. Otherwise, yeah, I think there's a, Boris, I think there's a mic or something that's going to go around.
Oops. Oh, sorry. Marcus, do we have also wireless one?
I will try. Does it work?
There it is, yeah.
Sorry, I lost my voice, but it's a little bit of performance. I'm very interested in the legal framework of your thinking, and specifically, we have had here the exhibition of Amar Kandar, the Sovereign Forest, which you know for sure, where again he places the legal framework of this question very much into the center. And I have 2 or 3 comments and questions around that. One would be, as you've mentioned yourself, many countries, including Brazil, have constitutions that recognize indigenous rights, natural reserves, whatever, but they're just not respected. And the infringements are enormous, and nobody is actually pursuing these infringements. And quite to the contrary, governments are part of the problem themselves, right? They are not just allowing, but actively. Can you hear me? Or is this horrible? Okay. So they're actively engaged in these kind of processes. So the question is, how do you monitor? Not rights is one issue, but then the monitoring and going after these infringements, the other question. The other question, and I'll ask all of them and you'll comment wherever you want. The other one is, especially in relationship to indigeneity. Actually, when you create or when you start thinking about the legal realm as the arena of discussion, you actually create a level of discourse which for many indigenous nations is very, very difficult to participate in. Just basically maybe because some don't have the expertise to do so, and because it's a type of discourse that might be very foreign to their ontologies and to their thinking, or as the Huni Queen has just said a few days ago, and we've had a number of these workshops here as well in Ernesto's exhibition on sovereignty, on ecological issues. And when I asked them about, what do they think about activism or political activism in a sort of a more engaged or Western dimension, the answer was very clearly, this is not our way. We believe in light, we believe in Mother Nature, we believe in peace, we believe in our type of discourses. Yeah. But here we face a situation where they are actually almost enticed to sort of leave their grounds, which I don't know more, for instance, does much more forcefully and rightfully, but not every indigenous nation would go that path. So again, the legal arena has certain advantages because it's transparent, but then again, maybe for specifically indigenous nations, that becomes a very difficult arena to participate in. Yeah. And then, and that's my last one, I'm also, you kind of mapped out the history of colonization with the history of land exploitation, which I think is, and I share that with you. But at the end of the day, this still means that we are still not decolonialized, and that actually the forms of exploitations that we continue to implement are still part of the colonial thinking within us. So actually, this sort of unfinished project of decolonization is at the end of maybe all of this thinking, a very strong sort of moment which still fires the developments which we see today. So
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you for those questions. That's great. All of those are extremely complex, so I'll try to respond and keep it brief. The first is the way rights of nature has been institutionalized by governments in often very paradoxical ways that don't end up supporting the practice of rights of nature. So it can be a form of greenwashing rhetoric, right? This is the worst case scenario. that it allows governments to make it seem like they're doing something that's environmental, but actually it contradicts their practices in when it comes down to support for industry and the fossil fuel economy. I think there I still yes, we're aware of that, and people who are writing intelligently about rights of nature are aware of this, I think that I agree with those who write about this and who are actively involved in it. That this kind of law remains open to different forms of realization, and it's crucial to have social movements and political collective activism in relationship to it, so that we can put pressure on political formations and forms of corporate power and judicial institutions to try to push the more radical and meaningful realizations of rights of nature discourse into actuality. So it's crucial to not allow for law to be a mere idealism. It has to be backed up with the force of social movements. And I think that we're seeing that increasingly, especially as governments over the last couple of decades have just granted a kind of, they paid lip service to environmentalism while making things worse and worse. Right? Climate change is nothing new. If you read the history of, we've known about climate change and the crisis since the 80s and even before, the 1980s. So here we are in 2015, things have gotten worse, yet all the governments pay lip service to sustainable development. It's a meaningless term. It's part of green capitalism. And the thing that will fix this is the social movements, activism that will put pressure on governments to change things. Will that happen? That's another question, but that's the hope. In terms of indigeneity in law, again, there's no indigeneity to speak of anyway. So there's no homogeneous identity that we can point to. Of course there are many indigenous thinkers who have pointed this out, that rights of nature is a foreign conceptualization and terminology, and it's a foreign language game that they don't use traditionally. Many indigenous thinkers have expressed this idea, but at the same time, indigenous activists, like the figure that I showed of the Seriaku, Jose Gualinga, explains in the video, yes, it's foreign, but at this time of environmental urgency, we have to use the tools that are available, even if that means translating our own positions into a Western vocabulary of law. And that means translating the indigenous belief systems, translating it into a Western legal formation that's part of a legal institution that has for centuries been responsible and complicit in the oppression of indigenous people also. So law is a very dangerous, double-edged sword in many ways. It's very complex. Nevertheless, there are many cases of indigenous practices where people are attempting to struggle for the ownership of law that will work in a progressive way, supporting indigenous rights. And I think we have to, that's something that we can, as academics, as exhibition makers, as thinkers, that we can try to investigate and think about and point to and create solidarity with. So that's something that this exhibition wanted to wanted to do. Finally, you mentioned in a very nice phrase, the unfinished project of decolonization of nature. I think that's absolutely right. That's going on. I'm working on a book project right now which will be called Decolonizing Nature, Contemporary Art and the Politics of Ecology. So I think this is an ongoing project. It's something that we're still immersed in this. I mentioned Arctic drilling. When Greenpeace assembles a group of kayaktivists to go after and stop the boat, the ships, and the drilling rig of Shell to prevent it from going to the Arctic, this is an act that is attempting to challenge the continuing colonization of nature. These are critical forms of collective political resistance that I think, again, we have to connect to. So here, there's I think a very useful term called intersectionalist politics. Intersectionalist politics tries to bring different elements together. So we can't think about racism, for example, without thinking about class. We have to have intersections that look at these different elements of sexism, of racism, of classism that function in different compositions according to different contexts, and this is, I think, also a really important resource for political ecology today. So we have to continue to think about connections between, for example, artistic practice, visual culture, and activism, legal activism as well, environmental justice movements, indigenous politics. All of these things, I think, can be brought together, and that's something, at least, that was our ambition in the rights of nature. So that would be a way to continue the ongoing struggle against the colonization of nature.